Andrea, and thank you to everyone who has made time in their schedule today for this very important discussion. My name is C. Armstead. I am the Director of Diversity and Inclusion with the American College of Healthcare Executives. And I also serve on the ASAE Research Foundation Research Committees as Vice Chair. So on behalf of ASAE, we welcome you this afternoon, and we hope you are ready to engage with this topic. A brief background on this project. This research was designed to provide foundational insights to help guide association members' efforts to successfully develop and sustain effective diversity, equity, and inclusion at the board level in governance practices. The research examined the current state of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also offers recommendations with regard to board governance, planned DEI strategies, and how they are measured. So this morning or this afternoon, we are indeed blessed to have an esteemed panel led by Dan Arnold, who is the managing partner and founder of Trifecta Research. We also have joining us Vicki Deal Williams. She is the Chief Staff Officer for Multicultural Affairs at the American Speech Language Hearing Association, as well as David Acosta, who is Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer with the Association of American Medical Colleges. So we are ready to go. Dan has a full schedule for us. And with that, I will pass the virtual baton to Dan. Welcome.
All right. Excellent. C, thank you so much. Yes, to your point, we do have a full schedule, and apologies in advance if I do speak quickly, but I do want to cover off on much of the insights that we've gleaned. Very quickly, C had spoken to the objectives, so I don't want to duplicate that, but I do want to speak to one piece of the research context before we convey the key findings, the implications, and our recommendations, and that is the way in which we structured the methodology. This is a three-part research methodology. Phase one was an exhaustive review of the published realm. Those of you on the phone who have dived into this DE&I pool in the published realm know how broad and how deep that pool is. It's very, very rich. So we started there. We mined the intelligence that we could find there. We developed our hypotheses. We then took those hypotheses to in-depth interviews with 7 subject matter experts, 2 of whom are with us today as our panelists. And in that process of engaging them in deep interviews, we further refined our hypotheses, further refined our knowledge. That was phase 2. We then took that knowledge to inform a quantitative research study, an online survey of just shy of 700 members of the ASAE member base, both association members, staff members, as well as board members. And we conducted a survey with those folks. And as C mentioned, it was designed to effectively assist the ASAE Research Foundation and the DE&I Task Force in informing the development of each of your models and actions so that you can effectively enhance your DE&I programs and specifically within your governance structure, number one. And number two, you'll see at the bottom of the screen here, the research was intended to enable all of you to identify and at minimum, mitigate the barriers and ideally eliminate the barriers that are very predictable and that too frequently prevents a greater alignment of DE&I strategy across the organization. So that was our objective. I want to share with you some of the key learnings, and let me get this banner out of the way briefly here. Okay. I want to share with you some of the key learnings and some of the key implications from those learnings. This is a sort of an at-a-glance, high-level view, a one-pager that gives you a sense of how these insights are organized. And we're going to address each of these 4 areas briefly. Then we'll roll into some of our conclusions and recommendations, and then we'll open the floor to questions. This is a high-level view. I'm going to break them down one by one in a little more clarity so that those on the phone can see that. So insight number 1, as we roll up our learnings, is that, you know, we toggle back and forth between current state and future state, right? Trying to dimensionalize and understand what does DE&I look like today within the context of association board governance, and then what might it look like? What should it look like? What could it look like in the future? That's the future state. Today, I would say that we are still very much enmeshed within what we would consider to be a traditional management practice as it pertains to recruiting and communication, 2 foundational elements within the context of DE&I. What does that mean? It means that the majority of boards, this won't come as a surprise to I don't think anyone on the webinar today, the majority of board membership today is comprised of white men, and white men between the ages of 30 and 59, number 1. Number 2, board seats stay filled for an average of 6 years. When you combine those or layer those 2 facts onto a standard practice of recruiting, which relies heavily on personal and professional networks, what you end up with is a traditional method of recruitment, which is to rely on like-kind references. Those boards, however, that do take deliberate and intentional steps to recruit specific demographics are successful in breaking out of that cycle and recruiting underrepresented populations to achieve some of their DEI objectives. So if those are our key observations, what are our key insights? Well, the traditional board recruiting practices do, in fact, result in respectful cultures. They don't necessarily result in new ideas or strategic foresight, both of which are key benefits of a fully mature and effective DE&I program. Number 1, efforts to recruit specific demographics lead to then dramatic success, which will not happen on its own. So left to its own devices, that typical, what we're calling a traditional cyclical process of like-kind recruiting based on personal and professional networks will not necessarily elicit the change that you're seeking, exacerbated by the fact that those board seats do not turn over very often. So recruiting is a foundational component, the success of which often relies on and is hinged on the intentionality and the deliberation of the steps designed to recruit specific demographics. That's observation number 1. Observation number 2 is the role that diversity gets. And this was a rich conversation with our interviews with the subject matter experts. In fact, although it is a DE&I program, there are 3 dimensions. There's a D, there's an E, there's an I. Of the 3 dimensions, association boards today, as we dimensionalize what current state looks like today, many, if not most, the vast majority of association boards are likely addressing diversity. Okay, so that has sort of found its way within the context of many of the boards who were respondents to this survey. And that inclusion is often, or that representation of diversity is often through a formal diversity statement at minimum. In addition, those who are tracking DE&I related metrics typically track metrics related to diversity. So when diversity pops, it pops within the context of a formal diversity statement. It pops within the context of metrics. That being said, equity, on the other hand, has the lowest incidence of activity in place today. And when it is present, typically it does not exceed beyond or progress beyond definitions and sort of agreed consensual nomenclature. Those associations who have or who plan to have inclusion-specific activities are few and far between. With that in mind, as we think about the implications for you all on this webinar and for the ASA member base as a whole, Because diversity is the most established of the DE&I elements, it garners the most attention and is the one that's most often measured. We can claim that we have, in fact, successfully implemented one of three components. What we want to bring your attention to is the fact that equity today is what we would consider to be in its emerging phase among most of the associations, and is at a foundational phase of this maturation, which represents an opportunity clearly to impact it. As many of you all are starting to your focus on it. That being said, what we're finding is that many boards unfortunately currently lack a sense of urgency in the addressing of inclusion, perhaps because there's a sense that what they currently have in place is sufficient, perhaps because they haven't gotten past the consensual definition phase, which typically is step number one. Okay, in terms of measurements, a key learning throughout each of the three phases of research is the role and the primacy and the importance of establishing a clear metric program and then monitoring those metrics. That being said, the key learnings that we want to share with you all today are: number one, nearly half of association boards do not track DE&I goals, despite the fact that as many as 93% have today or will have in the near future DE&I practices in place. So that is far under indexing the focus that they have within the context of DE&I, that being the tracking. That's point number one. Point number two, 73% do not have goals related to recruiting specific demographics. And then finally, more than half of the associations we surveyed have no regular schedule of review for either the goals or the metrics tied to DE&I. So a couple things that this brings to light that we want to share with you all. The association boards that are represented within the AAC member base, as evidenced by those who took this survey, may not be recognizing the value of either the goal setting or the measuring of the results in DE&I practices. Meaningful metrics may be challenging to determine, but metrics, and therefore it's a hurdle to overcome. But even when overcome, they aren't sufficient alone. They've got to be tied back to the goals. So to achieve those benefits, number one, goals need to be set and clearly articulated. Number two, they need to be monitored and measured, and the metrics of measurement need to tie back to the goals themselves. Those boards who have effectively done all of that, right, achieved the establishment of those goals, achieved the clearly defined metrics to measure it, and then tie those metrics back to those goals, are the ones who are most likely to realize all of the rich benefits associated with DE&I. Okay. Beyond measurements, there's a very, very rich sort of treasure trove of benefits associated with DE&I. As we seek to identify successful, effective, recommended practices that are designed to result in those benefits, there's a couple of observations we've made and we want to draw your attention to. Number one, despite the fact that there are clear recommended practices that bubble to the top, there is no single recommended practice that we can say the majority of boards that we surveyed practice, right? So they do bubble up, but they don't bubble up across the majority of boards, number one. The second point I want to make is as we seek to identify those practices that you all have identified as being the most successful, again, even though they may not bubble up across the majority of boards, when they do, you've identified them as the most successful and effective within the context of your DE&I programs. What are they? They are, as you see on the left side of your screen, it's regular reporting to the board, the association, or public. It's an agreement on definitions and vocabulary. It includes hiring outside consultants, and it includes tying goals to compensation. So those are the four elements, the four practices that sort of underscore and synchronize with all the learnings that we had from phases 1 and 2, but B, most importantly, are those that you all have identified as being most effective within your subsequent organizations. So as we think about what that means from an implications perspective, some of the common themes that we start to see that connect the dots, right, for the most effective DE&I programs include those that have and hold accountability to others, measure accountability to others. They are those programs that commit to making a financial investment, and they are those programs that align on important concepts for DE&I. That is effectively the connective themes or the connective tissues that not just tie together those four high-level learnings on the left, but many of the recommended practices that we heard throughout the course of this three-phase research program. Okay, if those are the key learnings, then our goal here is to make this as actionable as possible for you all, right? And so not only do we start with sort of the strategic level, but we always want to bring it down to sort of tactical implementation so that we can arm you with a clear path forward in how you can take these learnings and activate them within the context of your own DE&I programs within your own board governance structure. So at a high level, again, your one-pager, here are the 5 areas of recommended implementation practices. And I'm going to advance a bit and take you through each one of them quickly so we can get over to our panelists. So first one is alignment, right? Alignment on DE&I goals and tracking regularly. Those two things, goal setting and measurement, become the foundation. If recruiting is the foundation of ensuring that you've got diversity, as we seek to define an effective DE&I program, goal setting and measurements and metrics that tie back and reinforce the measurement of those goals is a core component to effective DE&I programs, and is our first recommendation for you all. That is key to achieving that wide and deep treasure trove of DE&I related benefits. Number 2, making it public. So once you've established those goals, once you've agreed upon how best to measure those goals, once you've made sure that those metrics track and tie back to those goals, it's not enough to have that in place, right? The next step, it ties back to the accountability theme, which you'll see recurring throughout this, and that is to set up a predictable, regular cadence for reviewing progress made against those goals and progress made as defined and measured by your metrics. And that regular cadence for review should be presented back to the members of the board, to the association members, in some cases when appropriate, even to the public. But again, it's designed to provide that constant accountability and the publication, right, of not just what you have committed to, but how you are making progress and building momentum towards achieving those objectives. Tying practices and goals to money. So money popped throughout this research in a variety of ways. Number one, it certainly is evident that, like any strategic initiative, a DE&I program well done requires an investment for sure. But more than just the front end investment, what we heard and what we're recommending to you all to consider in your own implementation plans is to make sure that there is some kind of a financial impact, right, of meeting or not meeting. So both carrot and stick. Meeting or not meeting your DE&I goals. You can do that in a variety of ways. You can provide access or withhold access to resources to the organization if those goals aren't met, or those that are more ambitious are tying compensation of senior leadership within the association to these specific and successful accomplishment of DE&I objectives. Again, the purpose here is to force attention and to force accountability so that everyone is rowing in the same direction. Okay, looking beyond diversity, we talked about diversity being sort of a predictable component of a DE&I structure, and the place that most of these boards start first, which is great. However, it's important to note that diversity alone will not help organizations achieve the entirety, both in terms of the breadth and the depth of all the benefits that DE&I can offer long term. So focusing on and ensuring that there is a very codified, formalized inclusion strategy and tactics to implement, as well as an equity strategy and tactics to implement. What we believe are what we believe two components of a very effective DE&I program, specifically programs designed to not just have short-term but long-term sustainable impact within the context of DE&I objectives. And then finally, looking outside rather to help. One of the sort of the death knell, if you will, of effective sustainable DE&I is status quo and is complacency. And to get outside of that and to break that those restraints, our recommendation is that you also look outside the confines of the board or even of the associations. Find those consultants, find those experts, bring folks in who are steeped in DE&I practice and strategy, so that you can align on goals, so that you can align on metrics for measurement, and so that you can effectively incorporate a change management program into the larger governance structure of the board. One of the questions that our audience is asking and is interested to understand is as follows, and I'm quoting here: "Our board has been focused on diversity, but have yet to focus on either equity or inclusion. We want to go beyond counting to make sure we hear voices with different perspectives. What should be our first step to evaluate, or what should be our first steps, plural, to evaluate our board's practices and operations to see how we can remove obstacles in achieving specifically equity or inclusion?"
It's funny, Dan, I asked this question back in July, maybe, of last year. We already had objectives related to increasing diversity, and I asked, has anyone figured out how to add equity and inclusion to an existing plan for increasing diversity? And I heard crickets. So I think there are a lot of us who are trying to figure this out. But one of the things that I've come to realize is the board has to start with itself, that the board really has to audit their commitment. They have to be able to articulate that commitment. They have to be able to have that answer to the question, what's the organization doing related to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And if the board members can't articulate that, there's a problem. So there has to be some board education. They have to understand what diversity, equity, and inclusion are, that they are not one and the same. So I think that that's a key piece first. I think it also means that there's a need to reevaluate what it is that they're using as a basis for that commitment. The board has to establish some guidelines, some principles that they're going to provide to the rest of the organization to use as a basis for how equity and inclusion get added. Are there absolutes? Are there non-negotiables? What do they feel they have to keep doing? Who's covered, who's not, who's affected, who's impacted, who's not? What's enforceable, what's defensible? What are the limitations and restrictions that they want to pose? All of those kinds of questions have to be asked and answered. And the answers to those questions provide, to me, the path to figure out how to address equity and inclusion. They also have to figure out what their current state is. What is it that they are currently doing and what they are aspiring to do. And that's where strategic planning really is the path to go. That if they know what the envisioned desired outcomes are, and if they have defined those, then they or others can back up and figure out how to achieve those outcomes. What do we expect to happen? Who do we expect to be here? how do we expect them to experience what we offer, whether it's goods or services or both? And are there groups within those groups that they need to account for and make some decisions about? So from the board's perspective, adding equity and inclusion is really just looking at the strategy and trying to figure out where and how it fits. And if it doesn't fit, recreating that outcome and then mapping the path to get there.
Dan, if I could
That's
just
great,
piggyback just a little bit on that too,
Please.
just to validate some of the things that, I think that introspective phase is really important. And I also think about how do I explore outside of that as well. And I like the adage of saying, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of boards out there that have done a lot of this work way ahead of you. In medicine, we look to the industry of business and the industry of education who have been doing this work since the 1990s. And what you could find, there are some assessment tools that boards can actually utilize to do exactly what Vicki is talking about, where you can actually assess your policies, your practices, your infrastructure, how you make decisions, what are those decision strategies, what are the group dynamics, how do you communicate, those sorts of pieces. And I would just bet there's probably some best practices that are out there within the association for the other association boards who may have done this. And it's a matter of just collating those together and then, again, practicing that in congruence with each other. So that tends to happen. And so, I mean, and even everybody knows about SWOT analysis. Well, doing even like something as simple as a DEI SWOT analysis. So the one that is looking through a DEI lens to look at your strengths, your weaknesses, the opportunities, which is an important piece of that, and what may be threatening you from moving forward. It's kind of an easy way to at least start the conversation going, and then utilizing, I think, content experts that you may either already have in the association or bringing some council efforts to help, drive that train, as Vicki was saying.
It's interesting, you both mentioned sort of a strat planning approach, right? Using traditional strat planning management consulting techniques like a SWOT analysis. That came through loudly and clearly in our interviews with the subject matter experts, right? Which was, not seeing DE&I as somehow separate and incremental to any other strategy that a board might take, be it member retention, be it membership growth, membership benefits, whatever it might be. So consistent there. David, I got another question for you, similar in nature, but a slightly different nuance. And I think what you just offered is sort of one answer to this question. I'm curious to know if you've got any others. It's as follows. Equity has become such an important and such a timely objective across so many parts of society this past year. What are ways that we can use diversity and inclusion as a means to achieve the end goal, equity? And it reminds me of a quote from the interviews that we had earlier in phase 2 this last year. Equity is achieved when everyone in the organization has the opportunity to attain their full potential. There's a lot of discussion about the intersectionality of these three.
Absolutely.
If equity is that goal, talk about that, ways by which you can use the other two as stepping stones toward that end state.
So let me massage that just a little bit in the sense of what I really think the end goal is. I don't think the end goal is equity.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
I see equity just like diversity and inclusions as means in order for us to get to the end goal. That end goal is excellence. We all strive to do excellent work in anything that we do in all parameters of it. And thinking about DEI as one of many solutions of how to attain excellence. It's not just DEI itself. And the second piece I think about this is that I see equity as just a third dimension, that we really never talked enough about. Business has been talking about it, and so has education for quite some time. And now we're starting to kind of bring that in to make some sense of that, just saying that they are all inextricably linked to each other, as dimensions to kind of move us forward. And so I think it's first and foremost, it's really important for people to understand and recognize how those three dimensions are not only linked, but also just a clear definition of what they really mean. Sometimes we have these complex definitions that make it that kind of stops the progression, stymies us because we get so caught, especially like, when the definition of diversity came out and everybody wanted, their identity to be included in that. And we get so stuck on that, we can't move forward. But I think looking at ones that work, For example, a simple definition of diversity, this is about differences. And diversity really is about leveraging those differences in order to basically benefit the organization association as one example. But I think understanding what each of those dimensions bring, but more importantly, the value that each of those dimensions bring, really understanding the benefits that each are bringing, those have been well studied and well documented, basically then helps you, I think, understand, how they play out with each other. And like you said, Dan, I think the important piece about this is that, there's no magic to what an equitable environment or workplace environment is. It's a place that ultimately gives the opportunities to everyone, no matter where you are in the hierarchy of your organization, but everyone an opportunity to attain their full potential, their full talent potential. And no one is disadvantaged, inhibited, or preventing from achieving their full potential because of their group identity or some other social position or socially determined circumstance. And so what this is really about, this is about equity advancement, having a workplace that really is intentional, but also has an intentional investment in everybody that works within that association, within that organization, so that they can achieve that full potential. Kind of to put it simply, I was listening to a speaker recently who talked about, in a simple way, what is this about? It's about giving employees, equity is about giving employees and leaders what they need, when they need it, and in the amount that they need to achieve their full potential. But the other thing we don't talk about that I think is the beauty part of this is bringing in things that we never talk about because of the undiscussable. So bringing equity in also brings this notion about that also includes gender equity and the inequities that we see before us that have been in place and embedded. But it also means today, especially what's been happening with the racial reckoning, it's talking about and including, discussions about racial equity and racial justice. How do we deal with the racial inequities that have been embedded in our policies and processes? How do we dismantle that, within our board policies and processes and within our association to really move that forward? And the nice part is that we have a lot of content experts now that have really studied this quite a bit to really help us so that no longer do we have to shy away from talking about the R word or race or racism.
Good, excellent. Okay, let me pull another one out of this list. Vicki, I'll go to you for this. I understand that resources, both time and money, will be necessary to achieve DE&I goals. But how much should we expect to spend and how long will this take?
The smart aleck answer is it costs what it costs and it takes as long as it takes. And I think to the point David just made, this is a way of functioning. It's not a project. So it's not something that has a beginning, middle, end. It's not like you check it off and wrap it up when you're done. Culture is dynamic. Intersectionality and the overlapping of identities is constantly in flux. Their impact is something that it's inherent to who we are as humans and is destined to change. So we learn, we grow, we change. And because of that, and because all of this has to do with who we are as individuals, there's not a point where we're done. So as soon as you think you have an answer to all the questions, there's a whole new set of questions that need to be asked and answered. We often hear people talking about allotting resources to DEI efforts, and that those resources are then being taken from something else. And this again circles back to that notion of strategy, that if it's a priority, it's a priority. If you've prioritized it, then yes, you're going to allocate the resources that are needed. So I can't really give you a dollar figure or even, well, like I said, I think time-wise, I don't think there is an end. So I think for people who are looking to say, we'll be done with this in 6 months, it's not going to happen. That shouldn't be the approach. There's a paradigm shift that has to occur. There are things that in some instances in some of our organizations need to be built into infrastructure and the way that we function on a regular basis, programming and processes and those cost money. They cost the same thing whether you're doing it from a diversity perspective, or if you're doing it from a finance perspective, or if you're doing it from a communications perspective. So I think, there are ranges that people can look at depending on what the outcome is that they're trying to accomplish. But there are also things that will and creativity will allow you to do at lower costs. There are right now, especially, a multitude of resources available, especially related to education for board members and members of our organizations. Some of those educational efforts can be taken on at lower costs. You can use something as simple as an existing TED Talk or a video on YouTube and have some really deep discussions as a function of everybody having looked at those. Sponsorship and partnership is another key thing to keep in mind, especially now. I know our sponsorship of our diversity efforts have doubled because everybody wants to be affiliated and associated with it, and I will gladly take your money and put it to good use. So I think that is another option for people to consider as they're trying to move their organizations forward in these areas.
And Dan, if I could add, again, I think this is, to our listeners especially who understand this, this is really no different than any change initiative that any association or organization takes place. We're used to doing feasibility studies, and DEI deserves that just as well. You have to determine how much finance you're going to invest in something, how much human capital you're going to need to pull it off, what's the market value of the product that you're hoping to produce from this, who's going to use the product. I mean, feasibility studies kind of sets that framework that we already know to do the D&I work. It doesn't have to be something totally different, awful, that we're not accustomed to. And this last thing I'll say too, I think even before we get to the strategic planning piece, it's really about creating that vision, really dreaming a little bit, just like you would with any change initiative, who you want to be, where you want to go. This is about making a real clear vision, like John Cotter would say, create the vision and then live that vision. And imagine what it looks like. And once you know what it looks like and you can define success, then it's so much easier to go back and look at what are the resources I have that we can utilize now. And that's where again, a lot of it may not cost because you may already have some things in place, as Vicki was alluding to. Secondly, what are we going to need in order to move that needle forward, right? And then in the short term, intermediate term, and long term, how are we going to achieve these goals? What are the resources we're going to need along that way? You don't need to suddenly hire everybody you need and everything you need at a time. It is this timeline focus, just as you would create for any change initiative you have in business.
Yeah, and one thing in addition to that, you mentioned change management, and Cotter, one of the things that we know right now is we have that sense of urgency.
Oh yeah.
In a lot of instances, you would have to create that, and we've got it. We don't have to. We need to be pushing and riding this wave to the extent possible, because I do anticipate that urgency is going to trail off. But we need to put as much in place as we possibly can to gain as much momentum as we can to move forward.
Good. Let me pull from some questions from the Q&A. This speaks to, we talked about some of the challenges on the front end that often prove to be stumbling blocks around definition and so on. Here's a question that seeks to find advice sort of post-implementation, right? Challenges post-implementation. Here it is. How can you help a board keep the course after committing to DEI? For example, they may be going along well, but then come up against member outcry, i.e. changing historic documents to be more inclusive, causing the board to waver or to try to appease members resistant to change, even though they know it is the right thing. Anybody want to, either Vicki or David?
I'll start.
Okay.
One of the things that I realized, again, in my experience in the last 8-12 months, there are folks who fall in kind of three buckets. And I'm going to say this as politically correctly as I can, but some of you know me. There is a bucket of what I will call, for lack of a better word, revolutionaries. They are ready to fight the good fight. They want to make sure everybody knows there are issues out here to be addressed, but they're not solutions focused. They are talking about the issues. There's a group on the other end that is saying, I don't even want to talk about this. This doesn't exist. It's not a problem. But the overwhelming majority, at least right now, are in the fat middle. And in that middle are people who are saying, okay, I get it. We've got some issues. We need to figure out how to address these issues. We just need help because we don't know how. And that's been my focus. It's, you know, probably the 80-20 rule, and I don't know that the numbers actually work out that way in my and on any given day, one of those buckets might be bigger than another, but that middle group and that group that is looking to figure out what needs to be done and how to do it, I think is where our focus has to go. And I think boards need to understand that. They need to understand that you're going to have people along that bell curve. You're going to have people at both ends of the continuum, and they have to determine, and that's why it's so critical for them to understand and be able to articulate the association's commitment to DEI and really understand it so that they can stay focused on action.
And I would add to that just by saying a couple other things. You know, the reality is that how we run meetings, there's some practices that out there that are very helpful in keeping everybody focused, especially when we have all these bullets coming in from the side sort of thing and distracting our attention. There's a lot of shiny things that distract us, and DEI is not alone. And we those who do the work are prepared. You know, we know about these shiny things that divert attention. And I think like any good board, any good association will do is that, you know, you've created values about what you believe in. You've created, you know, a mission focus. And in the good board meetings that I've seen is they laminate these, they're in the room, they may be on a digital board to constantly remind you with anything that you focus on, any issue you're dealing with, you always remind yourself, are we keeping within the mission orientation of what we're about and within the values that were there? Because that keeps you honest. And there's got to be people at the table that keep everybody honest. Sometimes that's why it's important to even have somebody like a chief diversity officer at the executive cabinet level who is the agitator, who is the one who's the champion that brings people to focus on that. But also think the last thing I would say is this is about mindset. You know, we all for so long, where we went wrong with diversity when we first started doing this work years ago, it was always on the periphery. And now over time, everybody said it's got to be central to what we do. It's got to be embedded in the culture and how we think. So it's really about changing this mindset that no matter what distractor comes in, no matter what shiny thing comes in, what you always have to ask is, how can DEI be the solution to this problem that we're addressing right now? That's diverting our initiative, right? But continue to ask it at that. I don't care if it's finance. I don't care if it's about hiring practices. I don't care if it's about whatever. You know, I think it's really trying to create that cultural norm that no matter what we look at, when we look at every issue, we always bring in finance, we always bring in tech. I'm just saying, why don't we also bring in DEI as one of the many solutions of how we tackle this, how we tackle problems along the way.
Excellent. Question here actually for Lynn Edelman, our trifecta VP of Quantitative Market Research, who was the lead researcher on this, and it's more of a logistical question or a statistical question as it pertains to the study itself. The question is as follows, Lynn, to you. Your recommendations are very interesting. Would you please clarify what was the outcome measure in the research that was considered evidence of success or evidence of failure of DE&I initiatives that led you to recommend these particular ones?
Thank you, Dan. We actually asked what practices were currently in place at each of the organizations. And then among the ones that they do have in place, we asked them to self-rate, if you will, the success, the level of success that they perceived by using that practice in place. So it was a scale data, so we could figure out which ones were considered more successful than others. And that's how we did that analysis.
Okay. Okay, I've got another question. David, you just responded to the last one. Vicki, I'll go to you on this one. This has gotten several thumbs up, so I think it's a shared question across several groups, several members of the audience, and that is, how would you approach DE&I in an organization that is global in its membership and board composition?
Yeah, I'm probably not the right person to answer that because our organization is not global. We do have some international activity, but I know that a number of practitioners that I've talked to have talked about some of the differences in expectations, and both culturally and demographically across organizations that are global. I think, you know, one of the things that I think is critical is ensuring that the foundation for whatever work is being done is based on what works within that country, within that culture, within, you know, their established norms and expectations. So, you know, one of the things that I think our organizations have to do is to be careful not to go in and assume that we know what's going to work for them. We have to look within their systems and figure out, again, just like with any other function, you know, what resources are available here? How do those get disseminated? And where can we offer suggestions or ask questions that will lead them to the answers they need about making change as opposed to imposing it.
And Dan,
David, any experience that you bring?
Yeah, there's an excellent resource that everybody should think about drawing from, and it's actually free. And it comes from the Center for Global Inclusion. The particular monograph itself was written by Julie O'Mara and Alan Richter, R-I-C-H-T-E-R. But what they are is they brought 95 expert panelists together from around the world, from many, many different industries. And they created this incredible global and diversity inclusion benchmarks to try to create standards for organizations around the world. I have never seen such a wonderful, comprehensive, compiled, thorough benchmarks as these. And essentially, we could probably learn a lot domestically from these and adopt some of these pieces, but it is all inclusive. And I would, you know, again, I'm not an expert on this at all, but this is where we're starting to look at as we're trying to globalize our association. Because again, I think if anything that the pandemic has shown us is that, you know, we collectively have to be global citizens and work together as researchers in order to combat things like COVID-19. So this is a great start for any association where you don't have to reinvent that wheel, as I mentioned earlier on. Benchmarks have already been out there, and this has been around for, the new edition is coming out soon. The last one was done in 2017. So again, if you just Google global diversity and inclusion benchmarks, it'll take you right to it.
Excellent. David, let me ask you a related question from the Q&A session here, but slightly different. And I think, you know, Vicki, you've got that great discussion that we had in our interview where, you know, so much, when we talked about the strategy setting, so much is about, you know, defining the future with questions and then effectively looking backward from there and determining the path forward that's required to get you where you need to be based on that set of questions. And there was a lot of rich discussion during those interviews around, you know, particularly from a diversity perspective, how do we, and what is the right set of targets, right? Set of agreed upon metrics for diversity. So to that point, the question is as follows. David, I'll start with you. To the measurement point, and it ties back into internationality, because I think internationality is a complicator potentially, but I think it's an appropriate question for even a U.S.-based organization. To the measurement point, are there any recommendations the panel has about how to determine the right demographic options when working with an intentional member base, e.g., race, ethnicity from U.S. context may be different in other countries? So whether you take it from an international perspective or just a U.S. perspective, any thoughts on at the front end, when you define both the goals and the metrics for, say, diversity in this case, what are your advice on the determination of demographic options?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Dan. Are you saying, how do we decide if we have the right demographics at the table from a diversity perspective? Is that what you're?
I think so. I think so. I think that's exactly. And you spoke to it before in terms of, you know, there's a gender component. You know, there's a lot of different unrepresented populations that within the context of equity need to have full access. So as you think about structuring that demographic goal, any advice on the guardrails? Any advice on how best to do that? Yeah, you know, for me personally, I don't think there's any guardrails, right? And I think one of the inhibitors and the barriers that we have is we set up tokenism in front of us. Oh, check, I have to have somebody who's Asian. Check, I got to have somebody who's Black. Check, I have to have X, Y, Z, et cetera. And I think that's a mistake. I think the reality is that, you know, if we learn anything from the research that comes from when you create an equitable and inclusive environment sort of thing, that tends to be almost a talent magnet for people who want to be involved if you're really questioning that, because now you've created this space where everybody can be authentic. Multiple identities are rich and they're leveraged. You've created psychological safety for people to be truly authentic without worrying about being judged or fear of retribution from it. And you've created this sense of belonging, right? What has been found in the research is that really is a talent magnet. And the people that have done this find that ultimately that it kind of impacts brand reputation, that now people want to work for you because you have a diverse workforce. You're open to everything. So for me, it's more about using cultural humility to what you bring to that table and constantly questioning yourself. Just because I may be Asian Indian, because I may be Mexican American, doesn't mean I'm going to give you a perspective that's going to enrich, you know, the full heterogeneous group to get where you want to with regards to creativity, innovation, complex problem solving. You got to test the waters out to kind of see what's there. Don't do it based solely on, you know, their demographic when they're bringing to that table, because you need both things. I think where we make the mistake, people say, well, you know, why do I have to have people of color? Just isn't cognitive diversity important? You know, and I think that's in one of those weird, those barriers or the slips off the cliff that we make. Because the only point I want to make with that is both cognitive, you know, and identity diversity are critical to success, right? They both are interlinked. They both bring treasure to the table. It's about people's lived experiences more than anything else. You know, I can come from a low socioeconomic status, demographic, community that I grew up in. And my lived experience, I started learning about adversity early on from the age, and I've learned over time that has matured me over time to develop my worldview, as opposed to somebody who may not come from that at all, that has not figured on adversity at all, ultimately comes to that table who may not have that broader sense or worldview. And I think that worldview is important. And most important about this gets back to the criteria that you use when you decide who's going to be a member of our board. How important is this, and how do people contribute to the diversity of that board, maybe the diversity of thought, but also their identity diversity, because we can't underestimate the value of identity diversity. And so frequently people will do that because they don't know how to get people of color, you know, to our table sort of thing. Vicki, thoughts on that?
Yeah, one of the things that I think is key is making sure that we're not denying representation. Representation matters. There's no question there. But you can't represent everything and everybody. You just can't, I think, to David's point. So I think there is a combination of cultural competence, cultural humility, culturally responsive approaches that gets us to a point where we recognize that individual experiences need to be accounted for, and you don't have to have all of them there. But how you account for those experiences can be different. You can have, survey information that, you get from a wide variety of voices within the organization, and you bring that to bear, as long as the group has the skill and knowledge to recognize that those need to be taken into consideration. It can make a huge difference in the outcomes that, and the deliberation and discussion that it has. So it's not saying that we should not strive to have diverse groups. We should, but you're not going to be able to account for everybody. So recognize that up front.
I agree with Vicki, and I would just add one other point, Dan, and that would be the best boards that I've seen operate usually have 2 or 3 issues-based representative seats available, so that whatever issue you're talking about, if you don't have that representation at the table, you have some seats at the table that's issue-based related. So if we're now covering an LGBTQ issue, then it forces the board to go out and get those content experts around that to help us. And once the issue is done and you've come up with some solutions and you have another issue, same sort of thing. So it's a nice luxury to have that flexibility, to really evolve that board into answering really cause due to a cause,
That's a good point. Good tie back into the learning, the recommendation too, around external expertise to drive that process. Okay, I do know it's a rich discussion, and I would love to have another hour to continue it. I want to bring it back to Sharon for a couple of closing thoughts. But before I do, I want to thank you both for your thoughts, your insight, and your guidance throughout this entire process. Thank you very much.
Great.
Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you, Dan, Vicki, and David for an absolutely phenomenal session. Very, very informative. And I thank you, our over 100 association professionals who have joined us this afternoon. I think that this is certainly a testament to the depth of interest and need for data in this area. The discussion that has taken place today will help inform some of the types and format of other deliverables that we will release pertaining to the implications and applications of this body of research that we'll make available to the association community. Also, would be remiss if I didn't give a special thanks to Dr. C. Armstead and the DEI task force, a smaller group of the research committee of the foundation, our wonderful group of volunteers who have helped to shape this research. And finally, we must acknowledge that none of this work would be made possible without the support and contributions of our donor community. So thank you to all of the donors who are present today and outside of this event.